In this video, I'll be looking at retro and modern platformer mechanics. So I'll start by summarizing some of the key platformer mechanics and how they work, and then we'll jump into Super Mario Bros. As the retro NES platformer and analyze that. And then I chose Hollow Knight, one of my favorite games of all time, as the modern platformer to compare it to. And then we have four main categories of mechanics that we're going to be comparing them on, which is jump and movement, combat and collision, level design, and difficulty. Then I'll wrap it all up by pitching a new mechanic idea, which is inspired by Hollow Knight, and then we'll have some key takeaways from it all. So when analyzing a platformer, these are some of the core mechanics you should be looking at. The first one is movement physics and jumping. This includes any form of acceleration as well as inertia, which is basically the constant moving velocity of a player in a direction. So say you jump forwards and you try to switch your direction backwards, there's going to be a bit of resistance because your player is already moving forward, and that's called inertia. And then jumps can also be variable or committed. A variable jump is just being able to jump higher if you hold the button longer. Committed jump is just jumping at a fixed height. Jump buffer and coyote time are also two important concepts. Jump buffer is basically when the game will register a jump input before the player lands, and coyote time is when the player is able to jump for a split second when they're actually off the platform. Before falling, they're still able to jump. Combat and collision is basically how the player interacts with the environment, so taking any form of damage, hitboxes, platforms, defeating enemies, and obstacles all count as collision. And then level design is all about how the levels guide the player, so some platformers are linear, others can be open world, and some can be interconnected like Metroidvanias, allowing for exploration. And the last mechanic is difficulty, which is just how challenging the game gets as you progress, and all the things that contribute to the challenge, so like checkpoints, where enemies spawn, their attack patterns, and penalties like losing items if you die. So I'll start by analyzing Super Mario Bros., the game that defined many of the platformer mechanics that we still see today. So for movement, it's very simple and strict, so you don't really have a lot of control over your character. Instead, it focuses more on momentum and physics. So the faster you run, for example, the higher you're going to jump, or the farther you're going to jump. And it also does have variable jumps. So if you hold jump, you jump higher. And there is no coyote time or jump buffer, so you need to be very precise. For interactions, you mainly defeat enemies by jumping on them. So if you collide from the top or sides, you take damage. And the enemy movement is very simple and predictable as well. So for example, Koopas will throw shells at the player, which you have to avoid, and the player also has to jump into blocks to break them. The level design in Super Mario Bros. Is very linear and it is a side scroller, so you just have one path that you have to follow until you reach the end. Each level gradually teaches the player mechanics, and you start with simpler levels, and there are also obstacles to guide the player. The difficulty also ramps up with each level, so the game introduces new enemy types with new moves and more difficult platforming and obstacles. Now we'll look at Hollow Knight, a modern platformer and Metroidvania game. So the movement in this game is very responsive and it features a variable jump as well. It is a Metroidvania, so there are 7 unique movement abilities that you can unlock in the world, and there's tons of options, and there is no jump buffer, but there is a very short coyote time, so the platforming is a little more forgiving. For interactions, any form of collision with an enemy or obstacle damages you, doesn't matter where you get hit. There is a proper combat system, so you have to hit enemies to defeat them and move around using your abilities to dodge attacks. And the most unique thing in this game is the pogo mechanic, which basically means the player gets knocked back when hitting something with a nail, so you can bounce off of obstacles and enemies by hitting them. The level design is an interconnected world. It is a Metroidvania, so it's a massive world that's fully connected, and the player has the freedom to explore wherever they want. Within each area, there are enemies, obstacles, and checkpoints or benches to guide the player. Other than that, you're pretty much on your own. Hollow Knight also focuses on ability-based progression. So the more you explore, the more new abilities you unlock, and then with these abilities you can go back through areas that you couldn't before. So that means there is a lot of backtracking that the player has to do. And finally, the game is very difficult. Enemies and bosses have complex attack patterns that the player needs to learn. Some bosses, especially in the end game, require you to master almost every mechanic in the game to defeat them, and there are also a lot of challenging platforming sections and optional challenges for veterans to do after beating the game. If you die, you also drop your currency and you can get it back or lose it permanently if you die again. So now we can directly compare each mechanic for these games, and I'll start with the jump and movement. So both games have variable jumps. However, in Mario, your running speed also affects how far you jump. So if you're running faster, you're going to jump a lot farther. In Hollow Knight, you also have much more control in the air and the player's direction changes almost instantly, so the movement feels much more precise. Hollow Knight is more forgiving with its jump timing and has a short coyote time. Mario is a bit more strict, and of course in Hollow Knight you have a lot more options for movement due to the amount of abilities. In terms of combat and collision, the games are actually pretty different. In Mario, your main way of defeating enemies is by jumping on them, and you can also shoot fireballs for a limited time through power-ups. In Hollow Knight, you have a fully fledged melee combat system, so you can hit enemies with directional attacks, You also have abilities like the Desolate Dive Slam ability, which gives you iframes, and there is an ability for attacking in every single direction. There is also the Pogo mechanic, which combines both movement and combat mechanics, which is unique. Also in Mario, you only take damage from the sides and above the player, and in Hollow Knight, if you touch an enemy, no matter where you collide with, you're going to be taking damage, so it is a lot less forgiving. There are also many more enemy hitboxes that you have to learn in Hollow Knight. And lastly, enemies in Mario have predictable movement. In Hollow Knight, some of the enemies actually have a proper AI, so they react based on the player's actions. Both of these platformers also feature very opposite level designs, with Super Mario Bros. Focusing on a linear progression, which you can see an example of a level right there at the bottom. It's basically just a simple path with no backtracking or verticality, and there is a time limit that forces the player to keep moving forward. Hollow Knight as a Metroidvania has a much more complex level design and interconnected areas which you can see on the map on the top right. It encourages the player to explore and backtrack instead of forcing them through the level, and it also has a lot of verticality in its areas that Mario does not. There are also tons of hidden paths in Hollow Knight and fast travel systems that also promote backtracking. And the last thing I'll be comparing is the difficulty mechanics. So in Mario, the difficulty progressively increases and the game does a good job at introducing the player to new mechanics. In Hollow Knight, on the other hand, you can end up in an area that you aren't supposed to be in and get destroyed for hours and hours because you're fighting a boss without an ability that could help you beat it much quicker. So the game pretty much never tells you anything and you're kind of forced to explore and figure it out all on your own, which is more satisfying but also more difficult. You also die in one hit if you're small Mario, and in Hollow Knight you have a health bar because it's much easier to get hit. Platforming in Mario is also a lot simpler, and later levels might have like smaller platforms or harder jumps to time, but overall it is much simpler than Hollow Knight, where you have to be really precise and control the player in the air and use the different abilities together. In Mario, if you die, you usually have to restart the entire level, so there's not many checkpoints, and in Hollow Knight you have benches all over the world that you can rest at and save at. Also in Mario, you don't lose anything if you die, so in Hollow Knight there actually is a death penalty, which can really set you back, so you have to be a lot more careful to not die. Enemy attack patterns are also much more complex and harder to learn in Hollow Knight, and there are a lot more enemies. In Mario, you have time pressure to worry about, so you have to move quickly, which increases difficulty as well. And in Hollow Knight, you also have optional content like DLC bosses and platforming areas like Path of Pain, which force the player to master pretty much every single mechanic in the game. So a mechanic that came to my mind when thinking about these games was directional dashing. Specifically, this would be great for a game like Hollow Knight, which already has a dash, but you can only do it forward in the game. This mechanic would pretty much give the player even more control and make the movement feel even more responsive than it already is. It'll also let you recover from platforming mistakes more frequently, and also having this mechanic could make for more unique and creative levels with angled platforms and obstacles like you can see in that little diagram. So that pretty much wraps everything up, and some of the main things to take away from these comparisons are that retro platformers focus more on the physics of the game and the momentum for movement mechanics, and modern platformers focus more on precise controls, giving the player as much control over their movement as possible to make it feel more engaging and responsive. Modern platformers are also obviously much more complex and give you more abilities and fun ways to traverse the world. Also, something interesting to note is how movement mechanics directly impact how the player interacts with the environment and enemies. One great example of this is the pogo mechanic in Hollow Knight. So players will be more likely to jump over an enemy because they know they can bounce off. And movement mechanics also influence level design and the difficulty for all sorts of platformers. And lastly, the player has much more freedom in modern platformers, and modern developers seem to trust their players a lot more, with understanding the game mechanics on their own through exploration, which makes the games more satisfying and enjoyable to play, compared to retro platformers, which pretty much just want their players to learn and beat their levels as quickly as possible.